Welcome to Regulatory Ramblings. Our guests today, Channing Mavrrellis and John Cassara, are the authors of a new report entitled Made in China, China's Role in Transnational Crime and Illicit Financial Flows. The report delves into mainland China's role in 4 different transnational crime areas: drug trafficking, counterfeiting, IP theft, human trafficking, and wildlife trafficking, as well as the illicit financial flows associated with such crimes, as well as what the international community can do to better understand and combat these activities, including some policy prescriptions. It was published by Global Financial Integrity, or GFI, a Washington, D.C. based think tank focused on corruption, illicit trade, money laundering, and abuses of the world's banking financial system. Channing is GFI's illicit trade director, and John Cassara is a GFI board member and previously a special agent with the U.S. Treasury Department. And with that, I will turn it over to you. Thank you for joining us.
Our pleasure. So thank you very much for the introduction, AJ. So I'm Channing Mavrrellis. I'm just going to cover, as AJ mentioned, we did cover 4 transnational crimes in this report. The discussion today, we're just going to focus on human trafficking and then counterfeiting and IP theft. So I'm just going to give a quick overview of our findings or discussion in the report about those 2 crimes. So with human trafficking, it was a very interesting research project and study in this because there's a very unique combination of social and cultural drivers and policies. There's some weak legislation and then the active use of forced labor that are at play. So GFI used data from the International Labor Organization and the Global Slavery Index, and we put a very rough figure of about $19 billion as the annual value of human trafficking within China. Looking at this human trafficking industry, it's typically divided between sexual exploitation and forced labor. So the sexual exploitation we found in China most commonly involves forced prostitution, forced marriage, and online sexual exploitation, the latter of which has close ties with or victimization of North Korean workers. They're at particularly vulnerable risk of exploitation in general, due to the fact that a lot of them enter the country illegally and therefore are more likely to take employment in the informal sector and don't have the same remedies that somebody working formally would. With the illegal status, they can be threatened to be returned to North Korea, where many might face a worse victimization or worse punishment than what they feel they're experiencing in China or being a human trafficking victim. In terms of the forced marriage issue, and China's now rescinded one-child policy coupled with sex-selective abortion, that is a preference for boys, has led to this very serious gender imbalance of what's known as surplus males. There's about 34 million more men than women in China. So this has directly contributed to what is known as bride trafficking. You see both individuals as well as networks, individuals as being men themselves looking for husbands, as well as individual operators and networks. Their target vulnerable women and girls, frequently from poorer regions within China, as well as in poorer neighboring countries. And some of this may involve consensual arranged marriage. Arranged marriages are not illegal. It's not human trafficking, but there were a lot of reports of men, for example, when looking for brides in Pakistan, Chinese men claiming they were Muslim, in which, in fact, they were not, in order to kind of seal the deal or get the acceptance for the arranged marriage. You also see them lying about their financial circumstances, what they're doing, and what would happen then would be that the girls or women would come back to China. They would find themselves in circumstances not promised and may be forced into either sexual or labor exploitation, or kind of just used just solely to bear children, for the benefit of the man and his family. Looking at the forced labor angle of this, you see it by both state and non-state actors, most frequently in manufacturing, construction, fishing, and agricultural sectors. Technically, the policy of re-education or reform through labor ended in 2013, but reports show that this is still continuing as a policy method for the Chinese government. Most clearly would be its use in Xinjiang province, where you have the repression and internment of Uyghurs and other Turkic-speaking Muslims. For a lot of countries, this with the involvement of forced labor within the manufacturing sector, there's serious concerns of forced labor in the supply chains, and this has been something that many other countries are paying attention to. Just a brief kind of regulatory overview. Human trafficking is targeted under Chinese criminal law, both sexual and forced labor. However, the law does have a very strong preoccupation with sex trafficking, which in particularly prostitution. However, prostitution can be, or I should say sex work, can be a voluntary or involuntary act. So sometimes they may be targeting the wrong people. It's also very focused on women and children. So they're overlooking the victimization of men. When it comes to the actual definition of human trafficking, it does not match the Palermo Protocol. So when it comes to them classifying, means of engaging in human trafficking, they're overlooking some types of coercion. Like forced labor is covered there. However, a lot of times when it actually comes to, enforcement of it, it's treated more as a labor issue, like a contract dispute, or an employer, not meeting regulatory or administrative laws. So you have administrative penalties versus actual kind of criminal act. Moving on to counterfeiting and IP theft. You see anything and everything that can be sold is being counterfeited. And so, anything from, I think a lot of people think of, fake luxury goods, Louis Vuitton. You also have fake Nike shoes, but you have kind of more insidious things, baby formula. You have electronics, chips, things that go into military supply chains or into high-tech goods, and counterfeit pharmaceuticals are also really up there. So there's a study a few years ago. China and Hong Kong accounted for about 86% of globally traded counterfeits. So, and we're not talking about the domestic trade in China and Hong Kong. We're talking about the global trade of goods from there. It would have an estimated value of about $438 billion as of 2020. In regards to IP theft, intellectual property theft, they're responsible for about 50 to 80% of international IP theft. IP is particularly a touchy subject for many foreign governments or many countries, as well as the private sector. The Chinese government relies on both soft and hard approaches to obtain intellectual property. They encourage Chinese citizens, or sometimes require Chinese citizens who work and study abroad, to engage in commercial espionage. They'll use vehicles such as joint ventures, research partnerships, and sales and trading investments to collect that information. And they also have a state policy of forced technology transfer. I do want to emphasize, though, that technology transfer is not necessarily a bad thing when it comes to, particularly for developing countries, to gain the knowledge and the skills to improve kind of their development. However, at a certain level, it becomes predatory. Chinese IP legislation, the biggest challenge with that is that it's founded around the idea of first to file. So that is, the law protects whomever is the first to file the patent versus who actually came up with the invention first, which is particularly challenging, especially for smaller companies who may not have the financial resources to, compete in court, or maybe not compete, but to pursue the issue in court. China has undertaken comprehensive reforms of its IP regime between 2018 and 2020. But again, you still have issues in terms of enforcement largely being focused on the sale of counterfeits. So the actual sale, so focusing on like the e-commerce platforms, there's been a lot of regulation of them in terms of strengthening penalties against platforms if they don't have secure enough, compliance and protocols to prevent the sale or prevent vendors from selling counterfeits. There's very little evidence of China actually going after the actual manufacturers of counterfeit goods. And this is also seen when it comes to drug trafficking as well. Instead of going after those companies that manufacture the chemical precursors and the pharmaceuticals, intentionally manufacture them for the illicit trade, they're going after the platforms.
Right.
So given the IP, the scale of IP crime in China, it's reasonable to conclude that the counterfeiting represents a relatively important share of China's economy. So in 2007, Euromonitor estimated that counterfeit products accounted for about 15 to 20% of products made in China. So this represented 8% of China's GDP. Obviously, the estimate is 15 years old, but counterfeiting has, at the very least, remained stable, if not grown over those years. So assuming counterfeiting still represents about 8% of China's GDP, this would be equal to nearly about $1.2 trillion in 2020. And what you can kind of postulate from there is that, considering the significant economic implications of this, you kind of see what's happening is probably a potential cost-benefit analysis with Chinese officials of the willingness of them to actually crack down on counterfeiting, which would obviously be very ideal to the international community, as well as to, put a really good dent against transnational crime and illicit financial flows. But it would also put a not so meager number of Chinese citizens out of work and obviously have a very strong impact on the economy. So those are kind of the overview of those two issues. I'm going to hand it over to John now, and we can talk about the financial side of things.
Well, hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, AJ, and thank you, Channing. First of all, I'd like to thank our audience for listening in. I believe this topic has struck a chord. It's resonated with a lot of people and a lot of institutions. I hope this paper will begin the process of evaluating and calling attention to China's outsized role in transnational crime and international money laundering. First of all, I'd like to call out Channing here. She is the chief author, she had the chief pen on this paper. I tinkered around the edges a little bit. GFI very generously put my name on it. This is Channing's work. And I'm very proud to be associated with it. That being said, I'm doing some of my own research on China right now, my own project. And I have three brief kind of general takeaways that I'd like to leave with you. The first is, up to now, we've seen individual cases or examples of China's, say, criminality, Chinese active criminality. But what we're missing, I believe, is the big picture. Totality, the enormity of Chinese transnational crime and money laundering, to me, is just absolutely staggering. I've been in this business for over 30 years. I've never seen anything like it. The average citizen, wherever you are, the United States, overseas, might be somewhat aware that the African elephant or the rhinoceroses are endangered because of China's demand for ivory, or tropical forests are being destroyed to satisfy the insatiable demand for Chinese wood products, or some might have knowledge of China's the largest manufacturing source of illicit tobacco products, or others may have experienced being priced out of their own local housing market because of suspicious Chinese capital flight. But the point is, these are all single issue and very focused stories. What we've been ignoring or indifferent to is the massive, as I say, totality or the enormity of what I call CCP Inc., Chinese Communist Party Inc., transnational crime and Chinese-centric money laundering methodologies that facilitate all this. Second, let me just talk very briefly about money laundering. The definition of money laundering that I use, we're very familiar with it, is the hiding or the disguising the proceeds of any form of criminal proceeds. And the key word there is any. And when you talk about any, you're talking about specified unlawful activities. So that's what Channing and I were looking at, these various SUAs, money laundering. So looking at internationally accepted data that covers specified unlawful activities, CCP Inc. and its actors, you can easily come up with total. The data is out there, but roughly speaking, China is responsible for about half the money laundered every year globally if you analyze specified unlawful activities. Now, to come up with that half very, very briefly, people in the audience know that the magnitude, the estimate of how much international money laundering out there is literally all over the map. But we normally accept the IMF's very round numbers, their estimate that roughly 2 to 5% of world GDP, or again, round number, approximately $4 trillion a year is the proceeds of crime. Of course, it depends what's included in the count. For example, some countries' jurisdictions, they count tax evasion, others do not. Capital flight, underground financial systems, some of these were included in that IMF estimate, others not. This paper looked at about 4, but there are another, say, 5 or 6, and Channing did some really, really good work on, the top, I think there were 10 or 11 SUAs that Channing looked at a number of years ago, where there's no doubt Chinese criminality kind of leads the world. And if you total them up, it's an easy $2 trillion a year. So using $4 trillion as that rough estimate of how much money laundering is going on in the world, that's why I come up with about half the money laundered every year, focusing on SUA, specified unlawful activities, comes back to China. My third major takeaway is that CCP Inc. is both directly and indirectly behind a lot of this. Channing talked a little bit about IPR theft, certainly identity theft, proliferation, in some forms of human trafficking, even narcotics trafficking. It's important to remember that China is an authoritarian command state. For example, here in the United States, trafficking of fentanyl is a huge issue. If China wanted to crack down on the fentanyl trade, it could. It could flip a few switches and they could easily stop the advertising for the product, including its analogs and precursors. This stuff is advertised freely on the internet and social media, but China chooses not to do so for its own policy objectives. It's also important to examine what I call China-centric money laundering methodologies, or money laundering methodologies with quote unquote Chinese characteristics. So in the world of AML, the Financial Action Task Force has made known that it feels like there are 3 major international money laundering methodologies: 1 through banks, 2 bulk cash, and 3 trade-based money laundering. There's certainly many more than that. Law enforcement uses the expression laundering money is only limited by the criminal's imagination. But there are some uniquely Chinese ways of laundering money, or where China's becoming the dominant player. We touch on some of these in the paper, but Chinese actors are becoming the money launderers of choice in, for example, the Western Hemisphere. Let me talk very briefly about the black market peso exchange. I'm not going to describe it, except to say that for years now, the U.S. Treasury has felt that the black market peso exchange is perhaps one of the largest money laundering methodologies in the Western Hemisphere. But that same methodology is not just confined to the Western Hemisphere. You can find Chinese involvement in black market exchanges literally around the world. They use some of the same trade-based money laundering techniques literally around the world. Another Chinese-centric methodology that is not well known in the West, but should be, is flying money by Chen. Similar to Hawala, that's better known in the West because of its ties to terror finance. Historically and culturally, flying money uses trade and the process of countervaluation, over and under invoicing, is a means of balancing books between brokers. It's done this for well over 1,000 years, since the Tang Dynasty, then 800 AD. Although normally used for money remittances, because it's so opaque and secretive, flying money is also used by criminals and criminal networks, almost impervious to detection by our traditional AML countermeasures, particularly financial intelligence. And of course, black market exchanges and flying money are just subsets of trade-based money laundering, TBML. Actually, trade fraud, or customs fraud, is the largest component of TBML, and similarly, abusive trade misinvoicing is the biggest element of illicit financial flows, or IFFs, and this is something that GFI, the study of IFFs is something that GFI has pioneered. China is the world's largest trading nation, and although this has never been systematically examined, it should be. If just a small percentage of Chinese trade is involved with trade-based value transfer and underground finance, even forms of capital flight, then you can easily add hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars a year in addition to that SUA total we were talking about. Another China-centric money laundering methodology is underground banking, sometimes known as CUBS, Chinese underground banking systems. Loose-knit network of money dealers, traders, cryptocurrency brokers who move currencies in and out of the economy while sidestepping the country's regulated banking systems and currency controls and capital flight restrictions. And Chinese authorities themselves admit that there are significant illicit proceeds that flow out of the country through these underground banking operations. Chinese money launderers also frequently use gaming or casino gambling. This has been documented in British Columbia via the Cullen Commission of Inquiry. Fascinating research has been done into this, and I encourage anybody that's interested to get online and to review the Cullen Commission's stellar investigative findings about the Chinese-centric Vancouver method of money laundering. There are many other heavily Chinese-influenced money laundering methodologies, facilitators and enablers. Some of the most popular ones includes the very popular use in China of offshores and secrecy jurisdictions, certainly corruption. Corruption by itself is an SUA for money laundering. The use of espionage, organized crime, CCP-sponsored programs that target and lure those with information useful to China, the proliferation of China-controlled free trade zones, lack of Chinese international money laundering enforcement and law enforcement cooperation in general, and a poor record of AML compliance. Now, some of these were briefly addressed in the papers and others not, but as I said, in the world of AML enforcement, China's involvement has been overlooked far too long. And once again, I think GFI papers breaking new ground in calling attention to China's involvement in transnational crime and international money laundering. So thank you, and we look forward to your questions or comments, AJ.
Thank you. That marks the end of the live portion of today's session. The entirety of our conversation with Channing and John will be uploaded shortly thereafter. Thank you, and please tune in.